Few words in the English language carry the raw emotional charge of fuck. It is blunt, versatile, shocking, and enduring. Today it appears everywhere from literature and cinema to casual speech and digital slang, but for centuries its origins were cloaked in uncertainty, speculation, and myth. Unlike polite words that trace neat lineages through official documents and dictionaries, profanity tends to live in shadows, whispered, muttered, carved hastily into margins, or scrawled where authority was not looking. That is precisely why the first known written appearance of fuck is so compelling. It was not born in a royal decree, a sermon, or a literary masterpiece. It emerged instead from anger sharp, personal, and unmistakably human-etched by a monk in 1528 who appears to have been utterly fed up with his abbot. This was not a casual joke or playful vulgarity. It was an act of rebellion preserved by accident, surviving centuries of censorship, religious reform, and linguistic evolution. What remains is a rare moment where history allows us to overhear someone from the early 16th century losing his temper in very familiar terms. To understand the power of that single obscene word, we must first understand the world that produced it. England in 1528 was still officially Catholic, still bound by monastic discipline, and still decades away from the full violence of the Reformation. Monasteries were places of strict hierarchy. Abbots held enormous authority over monks' lives, spiritual, intellectual, and physical. Obedience was not merely expected, it was sacred. Monks rose before dawn, worked long hours copying texts by hand, studied scripture, and followed rigid rules governing speech, movement, and thought. Complaints were rarely voiced aloud. Open dissent could lead to punishment, exile, or worse. Frustration, resentment, and exhaustion had few sanctioned outlets. Yet monks were also human. They argued, resented authority, and experienced moments of rage. And when those emotions escaped, they sometimes did so quietly scratched into margins, carved into wood, or scribbled where only the writer expected to see them. That is where fuck enters the historical record. The earliest known written use of fuck appears in a manuscript dated to 1528, written in Latin with English marginal notes. These notes were not part of the official text. They were not meant for publication. They were the equivalent of private graffiti and emotional aside written by a man who believed no one important would ever read it. The now famous phrase, translated and reconstructed by scholars, reads roughly as, "Fuck the abbot." The phrasing is blunt, aggressive, and unmistakable in meaning. There is no poetic ambiguity, no euphemism, no coded metaphor. It is direct hostility aimed squarely at a superior. The monk was not making a theological argument. He was venting rage. What makes this moment extraordinary is not just the word itself, but the intent behind it. This is profanity used not as humor, not as sexual description, but as an insult almost exactly as it is used today. Writing such a phrase in a monastery was not merely rude, it was risky. The abbot was the spiritual and administrative head of the institution. To curse him, even in private, was to flirt with sacrilege and insubordination. If discovered, the consequences could have been severe. This suggests that the monk was either deeply careless or, more likely, profoundly angry. Scholars believe the comment was written during a moment of frustration, possibly after a reprimand, increased workload, or dispute over doctrine or discipline. The word choice implies emotional intensity rather than calculated rebellion. Importantly, the monk wrote the phrase in English rather than Latin. Latin was the language of formal scholarship and official record. English was the language of emotion, intimacy, and immediacy. By switching languages, the monk stepped outside the sanctioned intellectual world and into a personal one. That choice alone tells us much about how profanity functioned at the time. By 1528, fuck was already understood well enough to be used without explanation. This tells us that the word did not suddenly appear in the manuscript. It had been spoken long before it was written down. Linguists believe it originated in Middle English, possibly derived from Germanic roots related to striking, thrusting, or movement. Unlike euphemistic sexual terms used in polite literature, fuck was crude and direct. That very crudeness likely kept it out of official texts. Scribes copying religious or legal documents had no reason and no permission to include it. Yet the monk's marginal note proves that the word was alive and functional, carrying a strong emotional punch. It also proves that it already had the insulting power it retains today. The word was not neutral, it was transgressive. The margins of medieval and early modern manuscripts are treasure troves of unintended history. While the main texts follow formal rules, marginalia reveal boredom, humor, frustration, and personality. Monks drew grotesque creatures, complained about cold fingers, cursed bad ink, and occasionally mocked authority. But profanity in marginalia is rare, especially profanity this direct. That rarity underscores how strongly the monk must have felt. This was not idle scribbling, it was a release valve, a moment where discipline cracked and anger escaped in ink. Ironically, the very informality of the note ensured its survival. Because it was not part of the official text, later readers often overlooked it. It slipped through centuries of censorship precisely because it was small, private, and easy to miss. It is possible, likely, even that fuck was written earlier in lost documents, graffiti, or letters that did not survive. But history does not deal in likelihood, it deals in evidence. And this 1528 manuscript is the earliest surviving written proof of the word's use in English. What makes it especially significant is clarity. There is no debate about meaning. Some earlier alleged uses of fuck are ambiguous, hidden in names or distorted spellings. This one is unmistakable. It is not a surname. It is not a coincidence. It is profanity weaponized against authority. After 1528, fuck would remain largely absent from printed English for centuries. It existed in speech, in jokes, in insults, but not in respectable literature. Printers avoided it. Dictionaries ignored it. Moral guardians suppressed it, yet it endured. The word survived because it fulfilled a linguistic need. It expressed anger, defiance, intimacy, and intensity in a way few other words could. The furious monk did not invent fuck. He simply revealed it. In that sense, the marginal note is not just a linguistic artifact, it is a human one. It reminds us that people in the past felt rage as sharply as we do, resented authority as bitterly as we do, and reached for the same verbal weapons when pushed too far. Today, fuck is everywhere. It has become flexible, almost grammatical noun, verb, adjective, interjection. But its power has never fully faded. Even now, it can shock, offend, or electrify a sentence. That power traces back in part to moments like the one in 1528, a monk, bent over a manuscript in cold stone walls, muttering under his breath, a scratch of ink, a forbidden word, a small act of defiance that outlived kings, abbots, and the monastery itself. History often remembers the powerful, the eloquent, and the official, but sometimes it preserves something better, a flash of honesty. In that angry scribble, we hear a voice unfiltered by doctrine or decorum, a reminder that beneath robes and rules were people who could still say, with feeling, exactly what they thought. And 500 years later, we still understand him perfectly.